In this video, we're going to answer the question, what's the difference between @static method and @class method when you're defining class functions? And so, first of all, what's this @ thing? I remember being very confused when I saw that, and it's called a decorator, and it adds functionality to things. In other videos, we'll get into how it actually takes that function and creates a new function with some additional functionality into it. But that's not important yet. We're not learning that. We're just trying to figure out, why certain methods within a class have these different designations. And, the bottom line is that each variation affects what gets passed in the first variable. So let's take a look here. I created this class called myCounter. It's just going to count things, nothing super fancy there. I've got an init, which you can set to 0 if you don't pass anything in. But see, this function isn't marked with anything. And so what happens is that Python will pass in a copy of the instance variable as the first variable, and then the rest of the parameters that you have. And by convention it's called self, although you could call it anything you wanted, but if you look at normal Python code, you're going to see self, so I would recommend sticking with that. Now, I created another function here, add count. Again, it's not marked with anything, so it's got self as the first one, and then you're going to be passing in an amount, and it's going to use this self.count, which is going to be a variable within that instance, and this is how you use the self that's passed in, and then you add to it that amount. Now, I did a third one to get the count just so we can kind of track and see how this works. Now, let's get to our next one, which is class method. Okay, here, instead of self being passed in, you're going to have an instance of the actual class itself passed in. Now, by convention, we call that CLS. Everyone uses that, so it's very obvious, hey, that's what's getting passed in. And here I'm passing in a file name. I'm going to open that file, I'm going to read in a number, and I'm going to create a class using class here. I'm just going to say, hey, give me a new one of those classes with the stored file count, and then return that. Last one is static method. This one, nothing gets passed in but the variables you give it. And so it's kind of a pure function there. But you mark this. Now, it has another special property, which is you can now call that function on the class itself. But we'll have some examples here. Okay, so let's go look at unmarked functions. We've got a couple of examples of using it here. And we initialize myCounter, which, if you remember, if I don't pass in anything, it has an initial of 0 here. And then I'm going to add count 500, which gets self count set to 500. Then I'm going to get count, and it's going to look at that instance variable and pull back 500. Okay, so now let's talk about and show some examples with class methods. So here I'm going to call myCounter with that from text, and I'm giving it a string that points to a file that I created. Now in that file, all I've got is 20, the number 20. And this is so that we can initialize it, assuming we saved an old counter and that's what it does. And so I do from text. Now that will actually use class and create class, if you remember, with what it reads out of that file. So that gives us an initial count of 20. We're going to add 35 to that, and sure enough, it keeps track of it, and we're now at 55. Now, the last one is the static method, and it allows you to actually call this function on the class itself. And here, I'm just saying, what's the biggest integer that this operating system can track? And it's this gargantuan, I don't even know how big this is, but without commas, it's very hard to tell. So that's it. That, in a nutshell, are the three kinds of functions that you can define in classes and how that affects the first variable that gets passed in or whether one doesn't get passed in if it's a static method. That's it. Please subscribe if you haven't. hit the like button. It really helps me build an audience over here, and I'll see you in the next video.